And we are just 10 days into a very violent second year in Donald Trump's second term. And despite once pushing for a Nobel Peace Prize, Trump's testing his so-called Don Roe doctrine to give himself unchecked powers here at home and abroad. Today, nationwide protests erupted in the wake of two separate shooting incidents involving Trump's emboldened immigration enforcement agency. And it comes as lawmakers fight to rein in Trump's aggression against Venezuela and elsewhere. On Thursday, 5 Republicans in the Senate joined Democrats to vote on the War Powers Act, an attempt to restrict Trump from taking further military action in the country following President Nicolas Maduro's ouster from power and capture here to the U.S. Now, Trump didn't take the resistance very well. He reportedly berated each of the Republican senators who voted on this. And Vice President J.D. Vance went a step further, calling the War Powers Act unconstitutional.
As the president, I believe himself, has already said, every president, Democrat or Republican, believes the War Powers Act is fundamentally a fake and unconstitutional law. It's not going to change anything about how we conduct foreign policy over the next couple of weeks, the next couple of months, and that'll continue to be how we approach things.
But as Trump lays threats against multiple countries, including Greenland and Iran, what exactly is the foreign policy playbook under this administration? Well, according to the New Republic, quote, the president has no real strategic vision. Instead, he increasingly sees belligerent violence as an end in and of itself, and a good show to boot. Joining us now, former assistant U.S. attorney and Army lawyer Margaret Donovan and political news reporter at Rolling Stone's Nikki McCann Ramirez. It's great to have both of you back on the show. A complete open defiance and disregard for our laws. This is a president who now says the only thing that guides him when it comes to international action is his own morality, no sense of international law, talking about invading or taking control of Greenland from Denmark, today bombing Syria, potentially going to war against Iran again, just capturing the head of state of Venezuela and basically renditioning him back to the United States. Yeah. It is a lawless presidency.
Yeah, I would say so. So, look, there's a lot that you just covered there, but there's 2 points that I want to make on the president's sentiment there. The first is that there are these international treaties, NATO, the UN Charter, the Geneva Conventions. Those are not just blowing in the wind. They have been signed and ratified by the Senate, which means that they are actually U.S. law. So under the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution, for all of you textualists and originalists out there, treaties are on the same footing as the Constitution and as statutes passed by Congress. So treaties are law. They're not just, these ideas out there that aren't binding on the United States when we enter them. The second point that I want to make is less legal and more philosophical. Those treaties that I just mentioned, specifically Geneva, the UN Charter, and NATO, those were all passed in the wake of, by the greatest generation, in the wake of World War II, who had lived through 2 world wars. And so there's this idea that that is our inheritance from the greatest generation. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we're now acting this way so lawlessly, as you say, at the same time when I think that generation's memory is basically disappearing, as they continue to pass on, and we have fewer members of them with us. So it's just a real sort of depressing thought. Sorry to share that. That we're losing that inheritance that was given to us, that was supposed to prevent us from slipping into this type of lawlessness and this mass conflict.
Now, I think about that a lot. The World War II leaders like General Eisenhower and General Marshall, who all they wanted was to never have another war again, so passionately. And Nikki, that's a sentiment among tons of MAGA supporters. They did not want more war. They wanted to end forever wars. They voted for Trump because he promised not to intervene and to not nation build. So how is his new streak of interventionism playing in the right-wing ecosystem?
I mean, he's definitely getting pushback. To your point is completely correct. This was a president who ran in 2016 on this idea that the wars in the Middle East had been a mistake, that this notion that presidents, if they just didn't call it a war, you could carry out a perpetual bombing campaign in a foreign country and you didn't need the approval of Congress, that was something that needed to stop. And of course, Trump this entire past year has been trying to bill himself as the peace president, as the guy who's ended 8 wars, which is not true at all. But at the same time, his supporters can't square that with the reality that we just even though we removed a very brutal dictator from Venezuela, plunge that country into a level of instability that could result in internal collapse, that we're looking to potentially blow up our treaty with NATO over Greenland, which we already had a military agreement with that allowed us to basically do whatever we wanted there anyway. And
except take the minerals, which is what this is really about.
Except take the minerals. And also, even in the negotiations in the Russia-Ukraine war, you now have this rare earth mineral treaty that's going to really benefit the United States, but we can't seem to lock down an end to that war. I think the same way we've talked about how Trump supporters, Republicans, keep feeling like the promises made to them by the president, by this administration, like transparency about the Epstein scandal, improvements in the economy, they are very much seeing a president who said, we're going to stop these wars, we're going to stop going into these needless military conflicts. Kind of tell them, haha, gotcha, what are you going to do about it?
Okay, so I have a question about all of this. I know you said you wanted to, leave the legal, academic stuff to the side, but we're talking about, effectively declaring war, if not literally declaring war. We played that clip earlier where J.D. Vance said, Vice President Vance said that the War Powers Act is unconstitutional. J.D. Vance went to Yale Law School. You teach at Yale Law School. What do you teach at Yale Law School about the War Powers Act?
So the War Powers Act has never been found unconstitutional, but it is true. Nixon actually vetoed it. It was passed by a supermajority back in 1973. But it's never actually been found unconstitutional. The presidents, in varying degrees, have said that certain parts of it are unconstitutional. There's a shred of truth in what he's saying. When it was passed in 1973, and it was passed, of course, in the shadow of the Vietnam War, and also at a time when Nixon was bombing Cambodia without telling Congress. And this was really a perfect example of one of the only times that Congress has really strongly rebuked the president in this way by passing this. So in 1973, part of the original War Powers Act said that Congress could end war by passing a resolution without presenting it to the president. And in the decade following 1973, Supreme Court case law basically said, actually, you do still have to present it. So in 1983, and that's the version that is currently being invoked by the Senate now, that new version said, yes, when Congress does act to end hostilities, they have to still present it to the president who can veto it. So it is a little bit toothless in that sense, but it does present an opportunity for Congress, if they can get a supermajority, to actually end a conflict. Now, there's one more point that I want to make about that. When Congress was passing the War Powers Resolution, they initially used the word armed conflict as sort of the threshold that they wanted to use to rein in the president when there is armed conflict. They changed that wording to say hostilities because they thought it was a little bit of a lower threshold and it was broader and it can encompass things like airstrikes that were going on in Cambodia at the time. And presidents since then have basically taken their own leeway with it by redefining what hostilities mean. And so that's how you've seen past presidents say, well, we're not quite at hostilities yet because it was just a single airstrike in Libya or, something like that. So it does not actually trigger my requirements under the War Powers Resolution. Now, the problem with that, this will shock you all, that there's an inconsistency in the White House's legal conclusions here, because as we've seen since September, the White House has been invoking armed conflict, which, of course, is the higher
invasion.
threshold.
They're almost like invoking at war with Venezuelan gangs and cartels that are being run by the Venezuelan government.
That's exactly right, in the Alien Enemies Act.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. The Alien Enemies Act, the whole justification they've had for booting people out of the country
is an invasion.
Is that we're at war with Venezuela. So I don't understand how they make all of these things consistent.
Very few people do understand how that works. But yes, your confusion is shared, I think, by most of Congress. And look, if nothing else, this requires notice, right? And so at the very least, maybe we can get some transparency on this. And I would think at a minimum, Congress would want to be notified, even if not everybody's on board with jumping into a resolution that's going to reduce or create some constitutional fight over whether or not the president can deploy the armed forces in this way.
Can I ask you quickly before we have to go? In earlier parts of the show, we heard from our reporters on the ground in Minneapolis that many Americans right now, especially in that part of the country, feel like there is a war very much being waged on them here at home. They feel like Border Patrol, ICE, other federal agencies, they're almost indistinguishable from members of the military. You're a former Army officer. As you see, Border Patrol has long had access to equipment and gear that is very militaristic, but it seems that is spreading to units and sort of subsidiaries of DHS that would not have had access to that part of the sort of culture and artillery in the past. As you see immigration enforcement in the interior look more and more like a foreign military operation. What does that tell you about where our country is going?
It's disheartening, of course. But what I will say, and Nikki and I were just talking about this before we came on, is you see this sort of laws don't matter, might is right doctrine as foreign policy. And what concerns me about what you've just outlined is there are very strict rules and statutes within the United States about what the military can be used for and what domestic law enforcement can be used for and what these various federal agencies can actually do within their authorities. And so looking at the might is right policy as for the Don Roe doctrine as foreign policy, you would be a fool to think that that wasn't going to be applied in the U.S. eventually. And so that's the sort of slippery slope that I'm worried that we're trending into.